Zoe, welcome to the podcast. It's amazing to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. I don't know how to intro you because you are quite the polymath and you've done everything from being an author to a journalist to a curator to a speaker. So just thank you so much for coming.
Oh, God, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And the studio is such a beautiful space. And, likewise, Aaron, every step of the way, you have been so supportive of everything that I've done. I remember many times at music festivals seeing you walk up just to give me a hug, just knowing how important it was just to see a friendly face. Just how hard it was, how hard the work was. I'll never forget at Glastonbury, 2011, we didn't even realize we were camping in the same field. And then on the Monday, when all the tents started to vanish, and I saw you and Sam, and I was like, oh my God. And I'll never forget, you said, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so happy to see you, but I've got to get in my van now and go back to London. And you said, no, you don't. You're going to go back in your tent. You're going to get some sleep, and then you're going to come home with me. And it was one of the nicest things that anyone had done all weekend because that almost destroyed me that weekend.
That was a tough Glastonbury.
That almost killed
legendary. I think we were trying to get in it was 45 minutes to our set. We were opening Shangri-La and there was mad mud. We got there and then we were like running through the mud and then the power went during the set and then we couldn't camp there because it was flooded, and then where we camped, the tent got robbed and then my wristband fell off. So every time it was one of those
everything that could go wrong went wrong. That weekend almost killed me.
Because you were also speaking, right? You
were working in a
I
tent. Wasn't.
Oh, you were just working.
No, I was running the decontamination chamber. I was running this huge venue in Shangri-La that was funded by the Wellcome Trust. I actually never once got to do any interaction with the audience or do any performance or do anything creative. I spent the entire 5 days just putting out fires, walking across the campsite. I spent half the weekend trying to get a parking pass.
Well, literally putting out fires?
Well, no, just like trying to solve emergencies, get wristbands for people we didn't have enough wristbands, and then we didn't have the right parking pass.
Fires
and I had
would
to
have
get
been easier
the
then.
fires
would have been simpler.
Fires would have.
So you were in production that weekend?
Yeah, I was in production, and all it was production nightmares, and I didn't have enough wristbands, and I spent half the festival walking across the site. I didn't get to see any music.
Shangri-La was cool though that year.
Shangri-La is it's always cool, but it's always a nightmare to run because it's where everybody goes at night after the music. It's where it's known as the after hours.
Slightly worse for wear, they show up there. So.
Well, my boss Debs Armstrong, who's brilliant, she called them the Visigoths. The way that there was this one year in actually this was brilliant. 2013, they split the field into heaven and hell. Now 2013 was also very hard, but that didn't kill me because we had already done it. So we downscaled what we planned and we made it a much tighter package and it was less complicated. Anyway, they split the field into heaven and hell, and in the hell zone, there was this guy that was the king of hell, and he wore a full suit of armor, and it was a real suit of armor. It weighed 1 million pounds, and he was on top of this huge throne with these pyrotechnics next to him and tons of fires and these minions going around and messing with people. And he had this huge 5-meter long stick, and on the end of the stick was a dildo. And he would look into the audience and find the most messed up person that he could find and shove it in their mouth.
Wow.
I loved
that sums up Shangri-La 2013, really. There we go. And one might ask, what does that have to do with music? What does that have to do with...
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, going back to Glastonbury not working in subsequent years, I think I appreciated it so much more.
I must admit, I did a trip as a punter.
Yeah.
Where I wasn't playing, and it was nice to go back to that and just watch some music and chill out and not have to...
Now that I don't work at festival, I mean, I did do some speaking events last summer. I went to Noisily, which is fantastic.
Yeah, heard great things
I
about
loved Noisily. Big up Noisily. I did the Secret Garden Party again, and I did something called Medicine Festival. And I had a few years off from festivals, partially because of the pandemic, but also I think so. The last one I went to was 2017, which was Glastonbury, and it was amazing.
Yeah.
And then for various reasons, I didn't go to any in the next few years. And I kind of thought it was behind me, just sort of a part of my life that I was ready to put behind me. And then Fred Fellows of the Garden Party, Secret Garden Party, called me up last year, and he was like, please come back. I was like, I don't know, I'm kind of old now. And he was like, look, I want you to come back. There's a lot of people I'm not inviting back. I've mixed up the festival and I've made it different. I was like, how? And he said, I've given 70% of the fields to the gay kids. I was like, that is an excellent idea because the queer crowd, they know how to party. And if you want to make that festival edgy and you want to make it different, give it to the gay kids because they were always avant-garde and experimental and humane and inclusive. So he convinced me to go back, and I had the best time.
And what were you doing?
I gave 2 talks. I gave one talk about the history of ketamine addiction.
Right.
Because it's something that I'm very worried and very angry about and very passionate about is the fact that there's been an explosion in clinics in America and Canada, starting here a little bit. But
so we should sort of prep it and say ketamine is one of the primary prescribed psychedelic therapies at the moment, because it's so controlled in a sense, because you can give it and it's an hour, right? It's pretty on off.
Actually, no, the main reason that ketamine is the one that's being used in clinics, now, first of all, it's not a psychedelic. It's a dissociative, and it doesn't. So psilocybin.
So is that a delirium? Is that in the delirium?
No. So deliriants would be like scopolamine, which is also known as devil's breath.
Datura.
Yes. So those are deliriants.
Or actually fly agaric as well.
Yes. So fly agaric does not contain...
Which is a mushroom.
Correct. Fly agaric mushrooms, which are the Super Mario mushrooms that have the white spots on the top of the red...
Those Christmas ones.
Those don't contain psilocybin. I think it's like 40 different psychoactive chemicals in there. They're very different. I've actually never taken them. Someone gave me one once, and it sat in a drawer for like 5 years because it just looked too terrifying. Mm-hmm. Ketamine is not a psychedelic. Ketamine is a dissociative. So LSD and psilocybin interact with the serotonin receptor in your brain. Ketamine does not. Ketamine interacts with glutamate, and it acts with the NMDA receptor. It's a different beast.
Right.
So it has some psychedelic qualities. It's a bit trippy.
The experience could be seen as psychedelic, but it isn't actually.
It's not really. And so it's not that it's not a useful drug. So it's actually listed on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines that every country should have, every hospital, every ambulance. And the reason is that it's safer to give you ketamine. If you're found in the street with a broken leg, it's safer to give you ketamine than a general anesthetic. You're less likely to have an adverse reaction or a heart attack or to have your breathing stop. It also can be given without electricity or an oxygen supply.
Yes.
So it first became popular during the Vietnam War because you could have it out in the field away from infrastructure. Yeah. So it's legal. That's the reason it's become very popular. Now, it can be used for what's called treatment-resistant depression. So it has what's called a rapid antidepressant effect. So if you have what's called treatment-resistant depression, you have tried a whole bunch of different pharmaceutical SSRI drugs, and they haven't worked. This is true of a lot of people. And ketamine will produce what's called a rapid antidepressant effect. So you will instantly feel a difference. Whereas if you take an SSRI drug, it will take 6 weeks for it to kick in, and you may not feel anything. Ketamine will produce a rapid change in your depressive symptoms. That is true. However, what they don't tell you at those clinics, and I think it's a crime that they do this, is they don't tell you that effect will go away after 30 days, but in a lot of cases, actually 5. So if you've been depressed for many, many years, and then you suddenly feel this incredible relief of your symptoms, but you crash...
From a session with ketamine, which is essentially a disassociative
so if
experience. You know, people talk about being in K-holes. I mean, that's when I knew about ketamine, because you'd be at festivals and you find people on the floor who couldn't move, and you sort of give them a glass of water or give them a hand up, and then a few hours later they'd be like, "You saved me, man."
I know.
Wow.
That's why it is very, very useful. And in fact, actually, so at these clinics, what they do is they give you infusion ketamine. So you don't snort it; it's injected into your vein.
Injected.
And I actually had that when I was 18 years old.
Yeah, I can't imagine the clinics giving it as a snortable powder.
Well, they actually are. They're actually now yes, there is actually a snortable form of ketamine that's called S-ketamine, and it was produced by Janssen, and it came in a insufflation tube that you snorted. Intravenous ketamine feels very different, in fact, and I had that when I was 18 years old. I had wisdom teeth that were impacted, that had to be surgically removed. So actually, at this point, I was a very wholesome Canadian kid. I'd only ever had weed and mushrooms. I never put anything up my nose. I'd never had any chemical drug. So they gave me infusion ketamine in my arm during the surgery, and it was amazing. It was absolutely magical. I felt nothing. I felt no pain. And I just listened to music. I listened to Belle and Sebastian, and I just felt blissed out. It was actually wonderful. And that ketamine is a very important drug for that purpose. But if I had been depressed for like 10 or 20 years and then felt that, there's no way I would only do it once. And there's no way that ketamine is not going to lead to an addiction epidemic in America because for several reasons. Number one, the clinics aren't regulated by a central body. So there's nothing stopping you from going to...
It isn't a centralized space which is controlling it.
So there's nothing stopping people from going to a different clinic every week if they can afford it, right? And there's already...
It's around $700 a session.
No. It depends on the clinic.
Really?
Yeah. So at Awaken...
So more or less. Oh, Awaken.
So there's a company called Awaken that is... they set up the first K clinic in the UK, and it's in Bristol, which is pardon my language, which is hilarious because Bristol is the ketamine capital of the UK. Like that was the K central. So Awaken will charge £6,000 for ketamine infusion. £6,000.
£6,000 for one session.
6,000. I think it's one or two. Plus, you also get therapy. There's a company called Field Trip. They charge about $4,500.
But we're saying £6,000. That's not a sort of months of sessions. That's potentially a one-off, one therapy session, one ketamine session, one follow-up session, right?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So it's insane. Wow. It's insane how much money they're charging for this, and there's no way that tons of people aren't going to figure out instantly that they can just get it off the dark web for $40. Right. Why would you? So there's also.
So you're worried that this is almost, as they say, it's going to be a gateway for certain people who suffer from resistant depression. They have a session. They say, well, why can't I just use it myself? And and
it's already happened. I can send you.
You do hear horror stories about ketamine. I know people who passed away from.
Yes, there has been 4 recorded cases in this country of people who drowned because they had a big line. They were used to doing it, and they took a bath. But it's just like having a glass of wine or a spliff in the bath. They thought it was totally harmless, and they drowned and died. Yeah. And there's also been cases in this country of teenagers who had to have bladder transplants and colostomy bags put in, like 16-year-olds before they're old enough to vote, having a colostomy bag put in, and in the travel
because of the use of ketamine.
Because ketamine contains the element chlorine. Right. It literally contains bleach, and it's incredibly toxic to the bladder.
Right. So ketamine is itself a toxic compound.
And there's only one other drug that also contains chlorine, and that is PCP, also known as angel dust. And
And is that meth or is
PCP is angel dust. Okay. It's not that popular, but it's weird. So ketamine, I'm very concerned that it's going to be the next OxyContin, that it's going to lead to an addiction epidemic. So let's not forget that heroin was marketed as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. That's why Bayer called it heroin, as in savior. And they claimed it was not addictive. Wow. And originally it was given in medical settings, and then it leaked out into the world, and now it's all over the streets in homeless populations. And the same thing happened with barbiturates. They said they weren't addictive, and they were. The same thing has happened with OxyContin. It was also marketed as being non-addictive. This story has happened over and over and over, where a pharmaceutical company markets something basically for profit and lies and says that it's not addictive, and they bury evidence. The ketamine clinics in America, they actually already, there's a company called Field Trip. As soon as I saw Field Trip, I don't mind saying this on the mic, I hated them as soon as I saw them. I knew they were liars. I knew they were fakers. I knew they were after money. They charge $4,500 for ketamine sessions, and their clinics, they are like the lushest spas you've ever seen. Flowers, beautiful decor, incredibly comfy furniture. And when you invite people into a space like that and you make them feel so good and you charge them that much money, there's no way they're only going to want to do it once.
And you're dealing with vulnerable people. And this is because people who have been suffering, from resistant depression are very vulnerable.
Incredibly vulnerable.
They're looking for any way to change their state of mind.
Exactly. They're taking advantage of incredibly vulnerable people. They're lying to them. They don't tell them the antidepressant effect goes away very quickly. Now, I actually have spoken to people in Canada who have invested in these clinics who have told me off the record privately that they don't think that ketamine clinics will exist in 5 years because by then psilocybin will be decriminalized and regulated, and psilocybin produces much better effects that are much more permanent. And so ketamine clinics will, I think, die possibly. I mean, it does still have its place. I'm not saying that ketamine therapy shouldn't exist. It can be very useful for treating alcohol use disorder. It can be very useful for treating people with depression. Like, even if the rapid antidepressant effect goes away, if you've at least had a break from your depression, then you at least know that another life is possible.
Exactly.
And that can be helpful. But the problem is that the clinics in America are...
But obviously, if you can have that through using something that's non-toxic and non-addictive...
And psilocybin is not addictive.
Yes.
That's important. And ketamine is very addictive.
And non-toxic, potentially,
yes,
as well,
exactly.
right?
And ketamine, I always call it the heroin for our generation.
Right.
Because I haven't seen any drug destroy my friends.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Agreed.
more
Yeah,
than heroin, more
we've
than
both
alcohol,
seen that.
more than cocaine. I've seen ketamine destroy people. We have two friends who developed
Cocaine's up there for me. But
yeah, ketamine
I've
though.
watched people go down, but ketamine has definitely seemed to have been sort of meteoric in the way that it can ruin people's lives very quickly.
It can ruin your life very quickly. It also has an extremely high tolerance profile, which means that you very rapidly develop a huge tolerance. You have to do more and more and more. One of my friends would do like an enormous line like the size of a pencil and could go to the shop, have a cup of tea, read the newspaper, barely feel it.
Yeah.
And when you're devouring larger and larger and larger amounts of it, the toxicity and the damage to the bladder, the people, I knew girls that had cystitis nonstop for years.
Yeah.
I know 2 girls who had to have bags of fluid removed from the lining between their vagina and their urethra surgically. Wow. One of my girlfriends lost every tooth on the right-hand side of her face on the top, every tooth, and she wasn't even 30. A beautiful girl. Now, thankfully, her dentist sorted her out, but that's traumatizing. And it makes me furious because Americans can be very inward looking. They don't pay attention to international affairs very much. It's the only country where they'll get away with saying things like, this is the greatest country in the world. And you'll say, well, what about your literacy rate? What about your rates of maternal mortality? And they'll just still say, greatest country in the world. It's a nation built on faith, and they don't tend to look at what's happened in other countries and the way they do things differently. So you look at their healthcare system, they don't realize how expensive and terrible theirs is compared to just having public health care. So our ketamine addiction outbreak in the UK went from about 2003 to about 2011, although there is some evidence that ketamine addiction is back on the rise now.
Yes.
But they had ketamine addiction outbreaks in Taiwan and Hong Kong in the year 2000, long before we did. So if Americans paid more attention to what happened worldwide, they would be much more cautious about this. And I really feel that today we're calling it a wonder drug, and there's all these big headlines in the New York Times about how amazing it is. I think in 5 years they're going to be saying it was the successor to OxyContin. And it's going to lead to a lot of trauma and a lot of pain. And the main concern is that when the roof falls in on the ketamine clinics. So let's say you've got a beautiful 20-year-old kid or a teenager or whatever who's got terrible depression, beautiful kid who's talented and smart but very depressed, and they've got a really rich lawyer and a really rich doctor for parents. The doctor and the lawyer, say they read a newspaper article about K therapy, and they think maybe this will save our child. They give it to the kid. The kid is smart enough to figure out how to get it off the dark web. And then say that kid winds up drowning or crashing a car or develops something terrible, or people will die. Someone's going to die. And if that person who dies has a rich and successful and vengeful parent, they are going to become the poster child for how ketamine is incredibly dangerous. They're going to become famous. And what my fear is, and a lot of people in the psychedelic industry are very afraid, that when ketamine goes down in flames, it's going to take other psychedelics with it.
Well,
that's what we don't want to happen, because this
is an emerging space for the treatment of depression that is
exactly. And depression is no joke. It is invisible and it doesn't get much sympathy because you can't see it on somebody the way you can, say, an amputation or someone in a wheelchair. But you cannot underestimate how debilitating and devastating it is for people who suffer from true depression. And it's a huge portion of the human population, and it should be taken very seriously. And unfortunately,
there aren't many treatments that are actually effective or proven, because SSRIs are just serotonin inhibitors.
Yeah, and they also numb you.
Yes.
I've never taken them myself, but actually I took a tricyclic antidepressant once. So a friend of mine who's a doctor gave me a few pills of, I think it was called lorazepam. I can't remember which one it was called. But she said, try this for your insomnia, because I've got terrible insomnia. And they did put me to sleep, but they made me feel crazy. Yeah. And then I looked up what it was, and it was an old tricyclic antidepressant from the 1960s. And I was like, dude, why didn't you tell me what this was?
Wow.
It made me feel terrible.
Because we know they're only about as effective as placebo.
It depends on the person. There's a guy in Canada named David Healy who was saying 18 years ago when I was a student at the University of Toronto that the efficacy of SSRIs was being vastly exaggerated. And also, Who wants to take a pill every day for the rest of their lives? You know, no one wants to. And the side effects from SSRIs, from the weight gain to the loss of libido to the, you know, someone said it makes the world beige.
Right.
That it takes away the color from everything. And this is the great hope with psychedelics, is that they can flip the switch in your brain, it like shaking up a snow globe, and it can rewire your brain. But they were looking at this in the 50s and the 60s and the 40s.
Yeah.
You know,
and this is why this explosion of ketamine therapy is potentially, because it's almost masquerading as a psychedelic and people are wrapping it in the same package when it actually isn't, and it has these elements of toxicity and addictiveness. It's a bit of a concern.
It's a huge concern.
Because these are the therapies which are being grouped and signed off by insurance companies in the US right now. And like you said, coming to the UK. Whereas you feel that I think it's interesting to see the difference between, say, psilocybin therapy and ketamine therapy in the treatment of depression and in how that would operate.
Yeah, they do very different things to your brain. So one thing that ketamine does do that is interesting is it produces something called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So what that is you can think of it as fertilizer for the brain.
Yeah.
So if you sprinkle BDNF on brain cells, it sprouts new connections between brain cells, and it makes also neurogenesis, which is the growth of new nerve cells.
Yeah.
So it is actually fertilizing the brain. However, what they don't tell you when they prescribe you ketamine therapy and talk about this wonderful effect, you get the same release of BDNF from exercise.
Yeah.
And it's not, unfortunately, as well, I know Americans, like my uncle, for example, was offered ketamine therapy for depression, but he was only very mildly bummed out, and it was also the first thing they offered him. It should be a last line treatment if you've tried a whole bunch of other things and they haven't worked. And it's the same problem with SSRIs in seeing the pill as the cure and not having your doctor talk to you. Do you enjoy your job? How's your marriage? How's your health? Do you exercise? What do you eat?
It's the equivalent of taking painkillers while jumping on a bed of nails.
Yes.
You should actually get off the bed of nails rather than take the painkillers and continue jumping on the nails.
Exactly.
And obviously that's, you know, I think that's what's happening in our culture quite a lot, is that people are in situations where there are real causes for depression, i.e. work, relationships, city life.
Yeah.
And rather than, you know, prescribing anything, whether it's psilocybin or ketamine or SSRIs, it's great to look at the causative factors.
What I would like the governments to be doing instead of picking up ketamine therapy is looking at the wealth inequality. You know, there's a great song by Marvin Gaye called "You're the Man." Everybody thinks about sexual healing and all of his sexy songs, but Marvin Gaye was also very political. And if you listen to the song "You're the Man," it's about taxation. You know, it's about the tax bracket, and it's about wealth inequality and how if poor people, how they can't rise up due to wealth inequality. And if we don't tackle that, we're never going to tackle the root cause of misery in a lot of people. I really feel that. And yes, there's lots of rich people who are miserable too. You know, if you have basically the human brain, if it's programmed to be very thinky, then you're also very vulnerable to depression because there's a lot in the world to be sad about. You know, there is a lot of misery. I don't believe what the Buddha said, that life is suffering. I don't believe that. I think the body is hardwired for pleasure, and that's what my first book is about. But yeah, depression needs to be taken seriously, and I don't think K clinics are the answer. And when they go down in flames, I mean, Field Trip is going bankrupt, and I'm delighted. I couldn't be happier. You know, Field Trip are now marketing. They just a couple of months ago started to market mail order ketamine. So they send you a box with an eye shade, some ketamine pills, and which is also very dangerous because that's going to go direct to your bladder. So you would sit at home, listen to music, do some K, and talk to a therapist on an app on your phone. Right? How is that not going to lead? There's also another company called Mind Bloom and another company called New Life. Mail order ketamine. What could go wrong?
It's a bit mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing.
But I think what is challenging is that there is this new wave of psychedelic therapy, which is up and coming. And I know you're very involved with watching it and mapping it from DMT, which is the active element in ayahuasca or some of the other psychedelics, to psilocybin. And there's some really interesting, you know, groups of people and research being done in the UK and in America, but it is emerging, and we're still waiting to have these therapies rolled out. And in this kind of vacuum before they're available, it is scary to see other euthogenics or other, I mean, it's not even a psychedelic, as we were discussing, being used and creeping into that space, because people very much are looking for relief and looking for options.
Yeah, they are. People are desperate, and they're reading a lot in the press about them, and there's a lot of charlatans and a lot of liars, both in the underground scene and in the overground scene. So in academia and in certainly the business, actually academia, there's fewer liars, but there's a lot of liars in the business world. There's a lot of people, and that's just the way capitalism works. If you can profit off the dispensing of something, you are inclined to exaggerate the benefits and minimize the risks for profit. That's just money. That's just water rolling downhill. That's how the profit incentive works. And there's also a lot of bad actors in the underground scene who are incredibly reckless and irresponsible, and they have no qualifications, and they, and also because it's not monitored, also somebody who may suffer from an underground psychedelic trip that goes terribly wrong, they're not inclined to go to the police about it because they've done something illegal themselves. So these things will go unreported. And there's a lot of casualties that happen in the underground that don't get spoken about, and it's a tragedy. And the psychedelic renaissance, as we call it.
And that's happening because of the lack of regulation.
Yeah, it is. And it's very tragic because the psychedelic renaissance, as we call it, is always very delicate because the backlash that happened in 1971, let's not forget, Richard Nixon said that Timothy Leary was, quote, the most dangerous man in America in a country full of guns where there were generals sending innocent boys off to Vietnam. He said that this boring psychologist from Harvard, who was a terrible writer, by the way, he said he was the most dangerous man in America. That's how terrified.
But dangerous because he was
telling
promoting
kids
the freedom of mind, potentially.
Well, he was saying tune in, turn on, drop out. He said all kinds of stupid things. He said women can have thousands of orgasms on LSD. I have found I'm more capable of solving a Rubik's Cube than having an orgasm on LSD. He was reckless and he was dangerous. And there were a lot of people who took a lot of acid who did go crazy. And nowhere near as much as the press said. The press was talking about kids jumping off of roofs and out of windows. It, probably did happen a few times, but nowhere near as much as the press said. But people were so terrified of it. The clampdown on psychedelics from 1971 onwards was so severe that for half a century, these drugs have not been explored and used for their potential as much as they should have been. And it's, the number of people who are dead from suicide and from other side effects of depression and so forth. And it's tragic. And my favorite part of psychedelic history is actually the 1950s. It's not the 60s. Right. It's not when the hippies got into it. It's when it was still just the nerds and also the military. The military's experiments with acid are hilarious, and we can talk about that. But my favorite stuff is when psychologists and psychiatrists like Humphrey Osmond were giving it to people with alcoholism, for example, and finding that it was remarkably beneficial. My favorite person who did LSD therapy for trauma was Cary Grant. So Cary Grant was born as Archibald Leach in Bristol in the 20s. And when he was about 11 years old, his mother vanished. And his dad told him that his mom had run away because she didn't love him. And that was not true. The dad had put the mother in a mental institution saying that she was hysterical and dangerous so he could divorce her and marry another woman. But Archie didn't know this. So when Archie was like 16, so Archie at 11 years old thought that his mother had abandoned him because she didn't love him. And then when he was 16, he literally ran away and joined the circus because he was a talented little boy. And he then went to New York City when he was like 19 or something. And then when he got to America, he was like, I'm done. I don't want to be Archibald Leach anymore. He changed his name to Cary Grant, changed his accent, changed his life, moved to Hollywood, became the biggest star in the world, the highest paid actor in the world. But the trauma of losing his mom when he was 11 was so deep. So deep. And then he found out when he was in his 40s that she was actually still alive and that she hadn't abandoned him, that she'd been put in an asylum against her will. He went back, I can't even talk about it without crying. He went back to the UK to find her. And he walked in the door and she said, Archie, is that you? And she recognized him. And what did he do? This very wealthy actor took her out of the asylum. He set her up in a private home with a couple of carers to look after her, and he visited her every, month or something until the end of her life. It's such a sweet, beautiful, sad, tragic story, but that trauma was still there. Like you can get over, sometimes the wound can be healed in some way, but there's still a really deep, deep wound that remains. He did LSD 100 times with a psychiatrist in Los Angeles in the 1950s when it was legal. And he called it an immeasurably beneficial healing. There's a film called Becoming Cary Grant that's all about this and his whole life, and it is so beautiful.
So he did 100 sessions.
100 sessions of LSD. in his 40s. And there's an incredible interview in this documentary with his daughter. So when he was about 50 or something, or 60, he then got married to a woman that was like his fourth wife or something like that. And he only had one child. He had one daughter. And at that point, when his kid was born, he decided he was going to stop acting. And he only took on the role of executive producer so he could be a full-time 100% dad because he was older as well. And he knew he wasn't going to have more than like 17 or 20 years with her.
Yeah.
And the interview with her is beautiful. She said that he was just the most devoted father. He gave her everything he didn't have, all of himself. And he was strict, you know, like you have to be home at a certain time, no running around, but he was gentle. It's so beautiful. And, you know, it's never too late to get your life back. It's never too late. And the most beautiful stories that I've seen in psychedelic healing are often from the people in their 40s and 50s and 60s. It's not the teenagers and it's not the hip 20-year-old hippies.
Yeah.
It's the older people who are carrying really deep wounds. For example, people in Israel who have been, you know, Holocaust survivors or the children of Holocaust survivors who carry those epigenetic scars. People in Canada who are the survivors of residential schools.
Yes.
People who were, you know, abused as children by the Catholic Church, that kind of thing. Those fascinate me much more than 25-year-old, as one psychedelic therapist I know called them Trustafarian bongo wankers. These like 25-year-old kids who spent a month in Peru and they're like, now I'm a shaman. Oh God, for God's sakes. Like in those cultures, you spend your whole life learning to become a shaman from the age of 5 or something, like 20 years it takes. It's not something you learn on vacation. Those fake shamans drive me insane. I can't stand them. They're awful people, and they charge a lot of.
It's an interesting phenomenon, and then obviously what happens is that other people who are interested in having these experiences and having this type of healing will run into these people who potentially aren't qualified, who aren't qualified,
who take advantage of them,
who have self-authored themselves as whatever it might be.
There's a lot of spiritual narcissists in the psychedelic scene. A lot of people who take themselves very seriously, are incredibly arrogant and incredibly condescending. And there's a lot of people who are just after power as well. Like, you know, and this is true of cults, it's true of religions.
This is true of any culture where there's value, right? Yes. These individuals will appear. But I think sometimes with the psychedelic scene, because it's a place for healing, people who have needed healing have come to it, and maybe they haven't actually had the experience of healing rather than the experience of taking on the power associated with the space or the ability that they see, which then becomes quite confusing in some ways because...
And there's no, like, you know, yellow pages for psychedelic therapists. You know, there's no guide to how to... No. How do you find a good one?
Because how would an individual now, if they were sort of... Because also, you know, I think when you're younger, it's easier. Like you said, jump on the dark web, find this, find that, research on YouTube. But for the older generation, I think it is a lot harder.
Yeah. It's weird as well for us, like, having a relative who's in their 50s or 60s say to you, like, hey, have you heard of this thing called psilocybin or ketamine therapy? And you're like, oh, God, for God's sakes, yes. I was saying to a friend of mine who runs something called Breaking Convention, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a big convention on psychedelics that happens once or twice a year. It's fantastic. It's not like a lot of other conventions I've been to. It's full of artists and weirdos and hippies, and it's really fun, actually. It's great. And I was saying to Alex Boehner, who runs it, I said, you know, I think in 5 or 10 years when psilocybin is regulated and it's everywhere and you see big advertisements for it in the newspaper, we're going to look back on the good old days, like 10 years ago, and we're going to think, man, do you remember when it was just our thing and like you had to be in the know and you had to have friends who knew about it and it was like our thing and it wasn't something that like the public had too? I think we're going to get nostalgic for that. But, you know, it would be cruel of us to prevent people who are not hip and go to music festivals and are surrounded by, you know, that kind of scene. It would be cruel of us to deny access to those drugs to psychedelic naive, normal normies, as we call them. Nonetheless, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the psychedelic world over the next 5 or 10 years, because an awful lot is going to change. And it could go many different ways. It could go very wrong. And I do...
Like you said, with the ketamine therapy, it does
and also psilocybin and LSD can also send you crazy if you're not... You know, there's some evidence that borderline personality disorder, for example, can be induced in people who are genetically predisposed or from their environment growing up but don't yet have it. And if we start seeing lots of people undergo personality changes, that will be heartbreaking and terrifying, and it could shut down the entire industry, and that would be awful. These drugs are not for everybody.
But this is the thing with anything of power. Any sword can be used and wielded for both good and bad, and should be used very responsibly.
Yes, every drug is a double-edged sword. Heroin. Well, I had morphine when I had my broken leg and I had surgery. It's amazing. These drugs, every drug has its place, including ketamine, but they're not all for everybody. And the danger is when we try to prescribe them as a cure-all for everyone. And also, we
don't have case history taken, contraindications, cautions, and that's where when you talk about individuals who feel a calling or take 2 months out in Peru and come back with a suitcase full of whatever, deciding to give it everyone who they know, these are quite important, extremely important factors that you need to take into consideration when you're working to actually treat someone and you want to do it in a regulated way.
Yeah. And, there was just a really big podcast that was put out called The Power Trip that was 8 hours long. I have to say I wasn't a fan of it. It was way too long. And I'm not going to slag it off too much. But basically it was going on about sexual abuse in psychedelic ceremonies, both in the underground. It starts off in South America. And I had heard rumors 8 years ago, people were talking to me about how common it is that naive, idealistic white kids go down there and there's predatory shamans who are often fake shamans who are just after money and power and sex. And if someone is under ayahuasca or something like that, you're very vulnerable.
Very vulnerable.
I heard tons of stories about sexual abuse down in South America. I've heard tons of stories about sexual abuse in psychedelic circles in Canada and the UK. But what is also not mentioned in that podcast is that it's something like the rate of sexual abuse in psychedelic therapy in regular psychotherapy, the rate of sexual abuse is about 8 or 9%. It happens in regular therapy too. It's not exclusive to psychedelic therapy. However, psychedelics do make it more likely to happen because you have people who are on a power trip and you have people who are very vulnerable. So there's a lot going on. But I'm actually very passionate about everything around the psychedelic that is actually more important, such as the therapy. So there's a woman named Roz Watts who is fantastic. She's a clinical psychologist, and she led all of the trials at Imperial College London looking at psilocybin for the treatment of depression. And she now is actually running her own outfit instead. It's called Acer Integration, and I just wrote a feature about it for a new publication that's called Supermind. And she's very passionate. It's not just about your psychedelic trip. It's about everything you do in the subsequent year or several years, actually. So there's an expression that people in the community have, which is that psychedelic therapy feels like 10 years of therapy in a day. And it does. I've had several experiences with psychedelics where it has felt like an enormous psychological breakthrough, and it has felt like 10 years of therapy in a day. But it's actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is then what you do with those lessons and those insights following that.
Integration.
Integration over the next year. So take those lessons and then actually embed them in your life. Because if you have a big breakthrough, but then you go right back to doing everything the same way you did before, a job you hate or whatever it is, anything you're doing wrong, drinking problems or whatever it is, you haven't really made the difference. It's all about integration. So Roz Watts' company, Acer Integration, it's beautiful. She sent me a whole bunch of the videos privately to watch that she's put together for it, and they are breathtaking. The way it's run is it's a 12-month course, and every month is based on a tree. And each tree has different lessons to give us. So, for example, February is the rowan tree. And rowans and in fact, actually, my last name, Cormier, is the French word for the rowan tree. So the rowan tree makes these big, bright berries. So there's different lessons that each tree has to give us. So the rowan is sort of about persevering during your darkest hour. It's about being able to survive the winter and then explode with life in the spring. Being able to survive the darkest times that you think you can't survive. You will discover resilience, and you will discover how much you really can tolerate and persevere through. The birch tree, I didn't know this. This is amazing. Did you know that the birch tree, if it gets a bit of its bark ripped off for whatever reason, a lightning strike or an animal or something, it will create a mushroom Band-Aid. There's a specific kind of polypore mushroom that will then cover the wound of the birch, and then the birch bark will grow underneath it, and then it will shed the mushroom.
Wow.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. Like, I've got a zoology.
Symbiosis.
Yes,
Amazing.
exactly.
Wow.
So every month is based on a different tree. So there's the birch, the rowan, the oak, and so forth, the maple, and it's different lessons that each one has to teach us about how to live.
This idea of integration,
yeah, it's beautiful. And it's interesting to me that a lot of the smartest and most compassionate and interesting people in the psychedelic scene are moving away from moving directly with the drugs and more focused on other things. So Roz Watts is focused on integration. A scientist named Mendel Kaelen, who I've known for a long time, has moved to focus on music. And he has shown repeatedly in his research, so it all goes back to a 2018 paper that has been nicknamed the Hidden Therapist paper. In his research, he found that the relationship and the experience that people had with the music they listened to in their psychedelic session had a greater impact on their depressive symptoms over the subsequent months than the intensity of the drug itself. The music was more important than the drug. And that makes so much sense to me. And he's very passionate about the idea that music itself is a psychedelic, that you can have psychedelic insights without drugs. You can have psychedelic insights sober. And you and I both know this very well, that music can make you feel and experience and understand things without any drugs. And so Mendel is focused on the music with his company called Wave Paths.
Wave Paths, yeah.
Their music is so beautiful. It is so stunning. I listened to a playlist that Mendel gave me a month ago that was designed for grief. So my mother died 2 years ago, and there's a lot I haven't processed. So I actually had written about Wave Paths for the first time in 2017. I wrote about them for Rolling Stone. I was the first person to write about Wave Paths, and they're now quite famous. And now Mendel has left academia entirely to focus on this company. And the musicians he's working with, which include John Hopkins, Gregory Haynes, a woman named Christina Vantsu, lots of amazing neoclassical musicians. And then what they do is they use AI, artificial intelligence, and generative software to sort of take musical samples and remix them in innovative ways. So every single time you run a Wave Path session, the music is completely original, which is important because you're not going to hear anything triggering. You're not going to hear anything you already know. You're not going to hear anything that might bring up bad memories. So, for example, someone was telling me that in a psychedelic session, they played some Pink Floyd. Well, her really abusive, horrible, alcoholic father loved Pink Floyd. So as soon as she heard it, she just got incredibly triggered. I listened to Imperial College's, in 2017, I took LSD and I listened to, at that time, the Wave Path software wasn't ready. So what Mendel told me to do was to listen to a playlist that he made for Imperial College London's research with psilocybin for depression. So the same studies that Roz Watts worked on. So he put together this playlist that was 6 hours long that was very, very good. And it has what people in psychedelic therapy, so you've got like sort of the rise of your emotions and you get to like a peak and then there's the ascent and the descent and so forth. There were certain parts in that playlist that moved me to my core and were so beautiful, and I bawled and bawled and bawled. There were other bits that I absolutely hated. It's got Sigur Rós in it, and I'm like the only person that hates Sigur Rós. And as soon as that came on, I was like, oh, God, make it stop.
Yeah.
But with Wave Paths, the new software is designed to be incommensurable, I think is the word. So basically what it means is that every time it runs, it's entirely original. You will not have heard any of it ever before in your life. And then I swear to God, hand on heart, I listened to a 6-hour session a month ago. Mendel did not, I have to say this for the record, no one told me to add psilocybin to it. I chose to do that because I knew it was going to intensify the experience. And the music is so breathtakingly beautiful, and it really is unlike anything I have ever heard. And I have heard a lot of music.
Because you wrote about this in your book, right? The effect that music has on the brain, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I actually only wanted to write about when I wrote my book. So in 2000, so I grew up in the music industry. My dad is a rock promoter. I was what's known as a backstage baby. My dad took me to gigs from the age I was born. I've got a million stories. I worked in a nightclub when I was a student, so I've and then I worked at music festivals for 6 years in my late 20s and early 30s. So I've spent my whole life in the world of music, and it's actually my first love. I often say I'm not really a successful writer. I'm a failed musician because I kind of thought I'd go pro, but I always got stage fright when I played the piano. I would always mess up my exams, and I just couldn't do it. And that's okay. I'm really good at what I do, which is writing and speaking, but I have the deepest respect for musicians because I understand what it is that they do. So in 2008, I wanted to understand, well, why is it that music can make us feel things? Because that's crazy, because it's just sound, right? So how can assemblages of notes, how can you listen to one song and describe it as sad and then listen to something else and describe it as happy when it's just sound, right?
How
it's
can
crazy.
maths and
it's absolutely crazy. So I wanted, so I spent a long time researching for a 2,000-word article for the Toronto Star. And I gave a talk at the Secret Garden Party in 2008, and I remember you sitting in the front row for this, in fact, all about how music affects the brain. And when I started researching it, I didn't realize how deep I was going to go and how much I was going to discover and how much it was going to blow my mind. So the main findings that, in a nutshell, music affects your brain like nothing else. It affects every single part of your brain will respond to music. So at the front of your brain, the frontal cortex, which is like the thinky decision-maker part, the hippocampus, which is a region in the middle that's shaped like a seahorse, and it's central to making memories and maps. Even the cerebellum, which is the wrinkly bit at the back, which is central to to balance and to movement and rhythm. Even your brainstem, right? The oldest part of your brain responds to music, but it doesn't respond to spoken language, but it does respond to music. Even better, music produces the same chemicals that are produced by orgasm and by drugs. So dopamine, which is the tasty chemical that's really associated with like cocaine and alcohol and addiction. Oxytocin, which is also known as the cuddle chemical, which is released by breastfeeding and by orgasm. And endorphins, which are the pleasure chemicals that give you those thrills and chills. Music releases all those things without drugs. And it also makes all the neurons in your head pulse in synchrony. And I don't mean that they pulse in time to the music. I mean all the neurons in your head start to fire together as one. Nothing else does that. And it also connects the two hemispheres of your brain, left and right sides, through a strip of tissue that's called the corpus callosum. And in fact, my piano teacher, this Russian guy, when I was 16, told me that music was the only thing that connects the two sides of your brain, and it's true. And music anatomically changes your brain. And it also is the only thing you can study that will increase your performance in every other subject at school. So mathematics, other languages, sports, every other subject, your performance will improve if you're given music lessons. Music is so good for your brain. But it's always the first thing they cut when they cut the curriculum, because music is just seen as superfluous entertainment, and it's not seen as so essential to the human species. And what I discovered when I wrote my book, so what happened was I wrote this huge feature for the Toronto Star, and then the newspaper industry went down the toilet instantly. So I had this huge thing that I'd written, and I didn't get paid for it, and it didn't get published. And then I just put it on a shelf for a few years, and then I turned it into a book proposal. I took those 2,000 words and I turned it into 7,000 words. And then it was the publisher's idea to write a book about sex, drugs, and music, which was my first book, which is called Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll: The Science of Hedonism and the Hedonism of Science. And I only actually wanted to write about music, but the publisher said, no one's ever written a book about sex, drugs, and rock and roll from a scientific perspective, and we think you're the one to do it. So I actually never even intended to write about drugs until I started work on my book. I only wanted to write about music. But music is my first love, and it's still my favorite thing to write about and research, and I prefer it because music has never broken my heart. Music has never killed any of my friends. Music has never busted up my home. It was there with me at the beginning, and it will be there with me at the end. It's my first love, and it's not just my first love, it's humanity's first love, because all the evidence suggests that we had music before we had language. There's an expression in anthropology that we sang before we spoke. So there's an evolutionary reason why it's so deeply ingrained in us and why it makes us feel so good. And it's also one of the very few universals. Not every culture has agriculture. Not every culture has writing. Not every culture has the number 0. Every culture in the world makes music. It's universal.
Universal language. Because we know that only about 10% of indigenous kind of medicine practice involves euthogenic substances or psychedelics.
Really?
It's only about 10. It's only about 10%, but 100% involve music.
Huh.
I have to check my facts when I'm.
No, I mean.
when I'm doing this with you, Zoe.
That's interesting. No, I mean I didn't know. I mean it's certainly not
but
true.
It's relevant because obviously when we talk about how important setting are in these, and how people go looking for relief from these symptoms of depression or stress, and how music and sound can interact with that. A lot of the time we have in the modern culture psychedelics being brought into that, and even though they are potentially part of it, especially when people are suffering sort of pathologically, we know that in indigenous traditions it's only a small amount. You know, if you look at shamanic practice around the world, it's only about 1 in 10.
Yeah, totally.
So about 10%.
Yeah, and you know, there's a lot of places in the world where there's nothing that psychoactive grows. So,
or they haven't found it.
Yeah, or they haven't found it. But going back to the work of Mendel Kaelin at Wave Paths, so he found in his PhD research that when you combine psychedelics and music, the combination of the two is synergistic, not additive, which means that it's not 2 + 2 = 4. It means 2 + 2 = like 16.
2 to the power of.
Yeah, exactly. So that when you combine the two of them, the result is incredibly
much greater effect.
Much greater effect, and that explains everything, and it makes complete sense to me. And also, if you do proper psychedelic therapy in a clinical setting, for example, you'll do it blindfolded.
Yes.
Because if you remove the visual inputs, your brain can more focus on other stimuli, and that is more likely to lead to new connections, new insights, new feelings,
neurogenesis, right?
Absolutely.
And a change to the default mode network, right?
So the default mode network, yes.
Are these normal paths that your brain patterns, you know, your thoughts go down. So people have depressive patterns that are locked in, ruminative patterns from trauma, and to sort of push out of that network.
Yeah. Like, I'm really prone to this ruminative thinking. So if something pissed me off, I'll just think about it over and over and over and over and over. Everybody does that, but I do it quite a lot. And psychedelics are really good for, as one scientist put it, Robin Carhart Harris, he said, it's like shaking up a snow globe.
Yes.
In that it's just, what you do is you get an increase in all those connections, and then you can get new connections made in the brain. And I was actually just explaining to your wife, Rachel, that your son, Wolf, that it currently is in a state of existence where he basically is on LSD all the time. So he's living in a synesthetic haze right now. So every color has a sound, every flavor has a color. He's just living in a world, this sensory explosion, which sounds pretty fun. And that explains the look on a lot of babies' faces, that they're just overwhelmed and shocked at everything all the time. It's because they're living in this crazy psychedelic rainbow where everything's mental. There's actually a lot of cases of people who develop synesthesia on psychedelics, and there has been a few cases of people who developed permanent synesthesia after taking psychedelics because new connections were made between different parts of the brain. Now, not always for the best effect. There's something called HPPD, which is called hallucination perpetual persistent disorder. And these people basically sort of see like, sparks of light or snow. Like they kind of have visual distortion all the time.
Or essentially the hallucination continues past the time when when your system is actually under it, you know. So
yes, it's rare.
Essentially
but
the trip doesn't stop.
Yeah, exactly. It's rare, but it does exist. And for the people in whom it exists, it can be pretty debilitating. So that's also another thing that the psychedelic community needs to talk more about and be aware of, because that is a risk. But that's the risk of all medicines. All medicines can kill you, and going back to what you said before, they're all double-edged swords.
Except for music, potentially.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, it's used in a torture context, you know, which it has been, you know, because obviously, you know, you're not allowed to torture people legally, but you can play them sort of Britney Spears on loop for 3 days, which will actually become more painful than having your thumbs broken.
Yes, you remember when the Guantanamo Bay playlist got released?
Yes.
And it had lots of like Disney tunes?
Yes. Yeah. Which is scary because that all came from a book that was about the positive use, right?
Which book? I'll write this down.
I'm on the spot. I think it was called, you know, the peaceful warrior. I have to find the title, but essentially the premise was it came during the 60s, that it was this idea of how would you approach another culture, first contact, and it was this idea of, you know, as an emissary of a culture or a world, when you met with another whole different world, you would bring beautiful music, you would maybe have gifts of flowers, of food, you know, you would have these things of beauty that you would share. Obviously, the CIA took it and sort of inverted it and turned it into a torture method because of its power. So yes, setting have a lot to do with all things.
I mean, if I had to listen to music I hate, like, I don't know, what do I hate? I don't know, Grimes. If I had to listen to that on a psychedelic, I would be profoundly miserable. If you want to talk about the military, there's one, I think probably my favorite book about psychedelics is called Acid Dreams, and it's all about the military's experiments with the psychedelics in the 1950s. So before the hippies got their hands on them, the military had an enormous research program looking at LSD.
They killed an elephant, didn't they, by giving it as much acid as they could?
It actually wasn't even that much acid that they gave it, but they had an enormous program where they were looking at it as a truth serum. They wanted to see if they could use it in a torture context to extract truth from interrogation. They wanted to see if it could be used as an enemy destabilizer, which is actually a kind of nice idea. So they had discussed.
Yeah, so this was there's a good YouTube video, right, where they give it to the soldiers and then they put them into a battle scenario and see they become sort of ineffective. So that was the idea. It's
actually kind of nice. There was this guy named I can't remember his name, but anyway, one general called it a way of having bloodless war. He thought you could just drop a load of acid bombs on, say, a bunch of Russian soldiers, destabilize them, and then just go in and capture them when they're all high and harmless. And it's actually kind of a nice idea.
Yeah.
And there was also a scheme to see if they could do, like, for example, lace a cigar with it and give it to
Fidel Castro.
So the CIA had a program where they consumed LSD themselves because they knew that they wouldn't understand how it worked unless they took it themselves. But then they also realized that didn't really accurately replicate the experience of being spiked. So they had a program where they all agreed amongst themselves to spike each other now and then.
Wow.
And so there was the best line in the book is, "Surprise acid trips became an occupational hazard." And at one point, the CIA ordered 10 million doses, enough to poison every man, woman, and child in America in the 1960s. And we still don't know what they wanted to do with it. We still don't know. It's absolutely fascinating. Acid Dreams is the most hilarious and informative and revelatory book. And I love it because hippies think that they invented it. Like a lot of things, the military did it first, and they did it better.
The military, they were there.
The military
giving it to elephants and each other.
Yeah, another
recklessly.
book. If you want to read some dark stuff, the darkest book is called Intoxication, and it's by this guy named Ronald Siegel. And he is not liked in the community. He is the only scientist who turned me down for an interview for my book because everyone hates him.
We're not a fan then.
Well, so what he did was, and it's the most insane book. So when I was researching for my book, what I would do is I would underline things that were important or surprising, and then I would go back and read the whole thing again really quickly and look at the underlined stuff. And in that book, there's pages where just every single thing is underlined. And it is the most shocking book. So basically, he felt that intoxication was the fourth drive. So hunger, thirst, and sex are the first three. And then he said the drive for intoxication is the fourth. And he believed actually that the drive for intoxication was universal. He believed that it was integral to all humans. And he actually was quite a compassionate guy. He wanted to understand the roots of alcoholism and heroin addiction, and he wanted to help people. That there was a nice side to him. But the way he approached it was to poison animals with psychedelics in the most insane array of experiments. And he did the most inhumane, disgusting, awful things to animals. And it's just page after page after page of him just doing the most twisted stuff. And the darkest of which is where he took little capuchin monkeys who were adorable and locked them in dark boxes. And then he trained them to smoke cigarettes. And he trained them that if they would smoke a cigarette, they would have a choice between seeing light or smoking a cigarette.
Wow.
But then so if they had the choice, they would prefer the light. But if he laced the cigarettes with DMT,
then they would choose the cigarette
because it would give them. And but he did this by locking them in dark boxes with no company and no comfort. He is
it's making me edgy just hearing about
it is the most terrifying, shocking book.
That's scary.
And he also, the most disgusting thing about it is that he never ever took drugs himself. He thought they were awful, terrible things that ruin people's lives. At the start of the book, he tells one story about being in Bolivia and drinking some coca leaf tea, and he talks about how awesome it felt. But he insists that he would never, ever take these things because they're awful, so instead he just spent 20 years poisoning animals. Terrible. Now, that is an awful thing to do. Now, however, other side of the coin, there was a legendary scientist named Alexander Shulgin, but the other side of the coin is a guy named Alexander Shulgin who gave us MDMA. Alexander Shulgin not only gave us MDMA, he made 2,000 different psychoactive chemicals. So his life story is basically he made a pesticide pesticide for Dow, I think it was, in like the 1970s. And that one pesticide made him rich for the rest of his life. So he became permanently wealthy from the patent on this pesticide that is still used. And he then went on to just play around in the lab and make psychoactive chemicals. And what did he do? Every single time he made something new, he would try it on himself first. And if he liked it, then he'd give it to his wife. And then if she liked it, then they'd share it with their friends. But he never gave it to an animal. There's also a rich history in America of patients in mental asylums and prisoners being given psychedelics against their will and locked in rooms, right? And then the scientists who did that said that these psychedelics gave them terrible experiences. Well, I mean, there's cases of American black inmates who were in solitary confinement being put on LSD every day for 6 weeks. And the scientists said, oh, LSD gave them a terrible time. Alexander Shulgin, on the other hand, every single time he invented a new chemical, it was first of all legal for him to take it because it was brand new, and he would always give it to himself first. And the word for that is chivalry. He was a gentleman, and he lived to be a very old age, and he was quite a character. He wrote 2 books. One's called P-Cal, one's called T-Cal. Phenylethylamines I've known and loved. And phenylethylamines I've known and loved, and I own them. I haven't read them because they're huge. They're like 1,000 pages long, each of them.
Wow.
I call them trippy doorstops.
Okay.
They're half autobiography, half chemical cookbook.
Wow.
So if you want to make drugs, the recipes are in there. So he's the one who gave us MDMA. And he also gave us 2CB. He gave us 2CI. He gave us a whole bunch of stuff.
Wow.
Not all of them are good, but yeah, he was an absolute legend and deeply loved. And I have to say, So
he wasn't putting the capuchin monkeys in the boxes, no?
No. Okay. And in
Okay.
fact, actually, I got the contact details for him and his wife when I was writing my book, but I got them from Rick Doblin, who runs MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And he's like, okay, so here's the deal. Alex has dementia, so you can't talk to him, but you can talk to Anne, his wife. You could talk to her. So here's her email if you want to get in touch. Now, I decided not to get in touch because those two absolutely adored each other. That was the love of her life, and I cannot imagine what it feels like to watch the love of your life cease to be able to speak, to cease to be able to be themselves. In fact, actually, my mother was the personal assistant to the screenwriter Christopher Hampton, who wrote the script for the film The Father, which stars Anthony Hopkins, and it's about an old man suffering from dementia. So I figured, that in 2013, when I was writing my book, I got Anne's email, and I decided not to contact her because I was like, you know what? She's going through the darkest, most tragic, most painful thing she'll ever experience, and she doesn't need some, obnoxious shithead journalist contacting her to ask her about all the drugs. She's told that story a million times. I decided to be respectful and leave her alone. And Alex died the year later, or his name was Sasha. He was Russian, and it wasn't widely reported that he had dementia. And I also am glad it wasn't, because I wouldn't want anyone to think it was due to his incredibly voluminous use of drugs, because lots of people get dementia. Both of my grandmothers had dementia at the end. And considering how many drugs he did and how smart he still was in his 60s, I don't blame the drugs. Dementia is a horrible thing, and it affects a lot of people. So I don't want to pat myself on the back or anything, but I just decided not to contact her. I was like, no, I'm going to leave her alone and show some respect.
Yeah.
And he gave the world a lot. I have a friend who a lot of people, after they've had a psychedelic transformation that's healed a trauma, they get tattoos of the molecules. I've got a friend who has the 2CB molecule and the MDMA molecule tattooed on his chest.
These were both invented by him, right? Wow.
Yeah. So he was an absolute hero. An amazing person. The real deal. You and I were talking about this earlier before we started recording this podcast. There's a lot of fakers in the music industry, and there's a lot of fakers in the psychedelic industry. And I know liars when I see them. And there's a lot of people in the psychedelic world who are lying, who are shitty, and they're going to lead to some harms. But there's a few companies that I really respect, and there's a few scientists I really respect. One of those companies is called Small Pharma, and it's run by a guy named Peter Rands. And I know Peter from 16 years ago because he was friends with a guy named Richard that I founded a company with to do events at music festivals.
Right.
So when Peter found out that I was a specialist reporter on psychedelics, he got in touch with me. And we went for a drink, and we talked about his research. So they're looking at using DMT to treat depression. He thinks thinks that DMT could be more important than psilocybin for treating depression in the brain. And the reason is, and this is amazing, DMT is the only endogenous psychedelic, which means your body naturally makes it. DMT is actually made by every single living thing on the planet. Grass, insects, whales, everything makes DMT. Some scientists, like a guy named Dave Nichols, they think it's just a metabolic byproduct. They think it's just a waste product and it doesn't actually have a role in the brain.
Yeah.
Other people, and there's a lot of lore, there's a lot of hippie myths around this, and there's a lot of devotion to DMT because there's a theory that DMT is released by the pineal gland in the brain, which is a little nugget-shaped organ in the center of the brain. So in your brain, you always have two sides. There's two hippocampi. There's two sides to everything, right and left, except for the pineal gland. There's only one. It's a little nugget right in the middle of the brain. The ancient Greeks used to call it the seat of the soul. And it's always been quite mysterious. And it sits actually right behind the eyes. And it's actually photosensitive. It can detect light.
So it's involved with melatonin production as well.
Exactly.
Which regulates sleep cycle.
Yeah. So some people think that DMT is released when you're born and when you die. And some people think it's the key to consciousness. We're not sure, but the research that Small Pharma is doing is fantastic. And I can tell you for certain that when my grandfather, who was 89 years old when he died, he was ready to go. You know, he'd had the most amazing life. He was an actor. He'd lived in, London and New York and LA. That he's the reason I have a British passport, is because he was acting in the West End when my mom was born. So at the end of his life, he'd done everything. I flew back to Toronto to be at his bedside when he died. He was my hero. He was my absolute hero. He was my favorite person in the universe. And I flew, my family was like, you're getting on a plane right now. He's got days. So I went to his bedside and I'm bawling. And I said, I love you so much. You're my hero. And he said, hero? What did I ever do? And he made me laugh. And then he said, so this is so boring. Meaning I'm lying here. I can't read a book. I can't go to a restaurant. I can't have sex with my wife. Like, I'm done. I've done everything. I want to go. I'm done. And then at the end, he said, I want no more morphine. I want to do this the way it's supposed to be done. I want to go out the way the maker intended. So no more drugs. And then about, 12 hours later, he turned to my aunts and my mother and he said, girls, there's Indians and there's trees all around the bed. I'm in the jungle. I'm hallucinating. Like, he was sober enough to know that he was seeing things that weren't there. And then a few hours later, he stopped speaking entirely. And he just stared into the abyss without blinking. Like, it was 2001: A Space Odyssey in there, man. Like, whatever he was seeing, it was the trip of a lifetime. And that's the way it's supposed to be done. And that was dignified and that was cool. So DMT is a very mysterious and very special molecule. I've actually only smoked it once and it was so perfect and so beautiful. I haven't done it since because I want to leave that experience just where it was. People tell me about bad trips that they had when they took DMT or LSD at like a really horrible squat rave. And I'm like, why were you doing it at a squat rave? Like, go and do it in the woods with your friends on a sunny day. What's wrong with you? So the research at Small Pharma is looking at using DMT to treat depression, and it's very promising and very beautiful. And it's also better than psilocybin in some ways because psilocybin will last 4 to 6 hours, whereas DMT will only last for like half an hour. So it's much more practical to dispense in a clinic, and it will be easier and cheaper. Also, the other thing is that I will say this in ketamine's favor. It's not my favorite drug, but on the plus side with ketamine, if you're having a bad time, it's gone in 15 minutes. If you have a bad time on acid, it could last 10 hours or a lifetime.
Yeah.
So Small Pharma is looking at DMT. And Roz Watts, who is a friend of mine, said, hey, did you know that Max Cooper, the techno artist, is making music for the DMT trials? I was already an enormous Max Cooper fan. He is one of my favorite techno artists. One day I'd had a really huge and promising meeting with the BBC, and I decided to treat myself to taking some psilocybin and to just listen to music in my garden in the sunshine. And I listened to his track Identity on repeat for about 2 hours because it's just so good. I worship his music. So when I found out that he was working with DMT, I asked Peter to put me in touch. And I skimmed Max's biography before I went to meet him at a pub, and I discovered he has a PhD in genetics. He has a PhD in computational genetics. And I was like, oh my God! So I've got a degree in zoology, but the stuff that blew my mind the most at university was genetics, actually. So I didn't want to be a scientist, and I certainly wouldn't want to be a molecular scientist because your life is very boring. You're just in a lab with pipettes and a computer screen. If I wanted to be a scientist, I'd want to be a wildlife biologist and go out in the world, or an ecologist. But genetics, though, if you look at the way that DNA works, and if you look at the way that proteins and the dance of molecules inside of cells, that stuff will turn an atheist into a believer, man. Like, oh my God. I used to get stoned, really stoned when I was a student, and just go to my genetics lectures and sit there in awe. It is amazing.
It's complex.
It's more complex than you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And every single arrogant computer scientist in Silicon Valley or at DeepMind working on AI who thinks that AI can exceed intelligence, fuck them. Every single one of them needs to be schooled in the art of biology because it is so much more complex than they appreciate, and it is majestic. As I said, I'm not religiously inclined, but that stuff would convert me. So when I discovered Max had a PhD in genetics, I was like, oh my God. I met him at a pub, and we had the most amazing chat for a couple of hours, all about, first of all, his music and the DMT, but also genetics and biology and how inspiring it is. So, we really hit it off. He took a shine to me. I think I'm the only music journalist that he's met who gets the biology side of his work. He also, Max has a music label called Mesh, and a lot of artists on Mesh, I already knew their work. So a guy named Indian Wells, who's an Italian guide from Puglia, a guy named Rob Clouth, this guy named Lear, who's from Wales, of course. Every single musician on the Mesh label has an advanced degree in physics or mathematics or chemistry or something like that. And Mesh's passion is the intersection of art, science, and music. And what they see themselves, and it's a small outfit, but they're all passionate nerds who care about two things the most, music and science. And they see science the way I see science, which is that it's not just a tool for making vaccines or drugs or new kinds of software or audio equipment. It's not just a tool. It's actually a way to understand what it means to be alive. It's a way to understand reality. And, philosophers and religiously inclined folk and theologians and priests and rabbis, they've always seen that as their territory in telling us what it means to be alive. I don't agree with that. I think science can teach us an enormous amount about what it means to exist, which is why I wrote my first book, which is about the importance of sex and drugs and music to the human condition. We are built to enjoy life. We are built for pleasure. Life is not suffering. I don't care what the Buddha said. The Buddha was a deadbeat dad who left his wife. I don't give a fuck what he thinks. Sorry, pardon my language. I don't care at all. I do not care what the Buddha has to say. He was a spoiled rich kid who left his wife. He should have just gotten a job. But
no judgment, and anyone can obviously achieve enlightenment through any means, and
So the Mesh label, they're all amazing, talented, smart people. It's a small outfit, and they're amazing. And Max took a shine to me, and then I worship his music. And so he then invited me to lots of private listening sessions that he was doing at a studio called L Acoustics, which is in Highgate, and it's actually close to where I live. So they are... L Acoustics was actually devised by a guy with a PhD in particle physics, and they invented the line source array, which is when you're at a gig and you see two huge stacks of speakers on either side of the stage. He invented that. I said to the sound engineer from the club that I worked at when I was a student, I was like, hey, do you know who L Acoustics are? He said, of course I do. I trained on the line source array when I was a student. That's what I've always worked with. I said, oh, I'm going for a private tour next week. And he's like, I hate you. So I've been to lots of private sessions there, including one that you came to. Max also invited me to private screenings of his new album, Unspoken Words, at the Dolby Studio, which is in Soho. And so Max is a very generous man. I was talking to his manager 2 days ago, and I said, it's kind of like he sort of could be like the Chuck D. In the way that Chuck D has become a paternal figure who nourishes lots of young talent, Max does very similar things. He's hand-picked musicians he wants to work with and nourishes them. He also hand-picks artists, and the music videos for his work are so beautiful and so mind-blowing. One of them, I can't remember the name of the track. It'll come to me in a minute, but it was composed with 10,000 hand drawings that were done digitally stitched together, and it's incredible.
Wow.
Everything that they put out is put out with great love and great care, and it's not about the money. It's about the music and it's about the art. And what they see themselves as is a Renaissance outfit. So the division between art and science didn't used to exist. So Da Vinci, for example, they just sort of saw art and science as being two different ways to understand the visual spectrum, but not being divisive. It's only in the modern era that we've split things into humanities and into sciences. And it's bad for students to only study one or the other. It's bad for the human soul. Everybody should get to study both. And they see themselves, Mesh, as the forerunners of bringing that idea back to life. And I am incredibly flattered and incredibly honored to now be part of that team. I'll be giving a talk on May 13th, which I think will be before this podcast comes out. And I'll be talking about archaeoacoustics. which is the ancient practice of devising theaters and temples for sound. So if you go into ancient amphitheaters, if you go into huge cathedrals, they're built to take the acoustics into account.
Yes.
It's only when we started to have electronically amplified music and speakers and so forth since the 1940s,
Yes.
or I guess it's the invention of radio,
Yeah.
that
the shape has changed, because the traditional amphitheatre is actually an amplification in itself.
Exactly. Like my
in the
mum
way
and
that
my
it's
aunt.
designed, yeah.
My mum and my aunt in Italy in the 1960s, they went to a Roman amphitheater, and one of them stood at the bottom and one of them stood at the top, and there was like 200 meters between them or something, and they could whisper and hear everything perfectly. Those spaces are insane.
Yeah.
Max Cooper got to perform in the Acropolis, for example, and he's like, yeah, the space is insane. But it's in the modern era. Basically, amplified music has allowed us to become lazy. So you can put on raves in warehouses and, flat square box rooms that sound terrible. There's a club in Toronto, for example, called The Warehouse, because it was a warehouse.
Yeah.
I've only seen one musician ever rock that space, and that was Bjork. Well, not everyone has Bjork's voice. So the whole mesh team, so Max is giving a talk, this guy named Lear is giving a talk, and all of us are going to be looking at what's called 4D sound. So looking at different aspects of acoustics and three-dimensional sound. So that's on May 13th at a place called the Stone Nest in Soho, and I am so honored to have been invited to be part of this, because it's not every day you meet someone that you absolutely worship and they want to work with you. And he is a nice guy. He's from Belfast. He is a massive nerd. His wife is an accountant. That's how you know he's the real deal. He's not a fame whore. He is sweet as hell. He is smart as hell. And he's a nice guy. And I'm so grateful to have met him through all of my connections. And it's taken a long time to get here. And I feel very privileged.
Yeah, I know, because I do remember you talking about him in the past. So it's
he's
pretty cool
he
that
is
you've
a
managed
genius.
to connect in.
And he has no musical training. He
Amazing.
never studied music. He's all self-taught, which
Wow.
is actually really interesting. So I studied music for a long time, but as you probably know, a lot of times when you study music, it's bad for you in a way.
Yeah.
You get a lot of performance anxiety. You get a lot of obsession with being perfect. I can't jam. I can't improvise. I can't write music. Studying music can really rob you.
I'm sure we could get there, Zoe.
Maybe.
It might take a while.
Maybe. I mean, I'd need to.
But
I think I'd need to.
understand when you've been trained classically,
Yeah.
it can be a challenge to sort of have freedom in the space, because you see you get taught a lot of the architecture of it, and it's then hard to ignore.
Yeah, it's same things with like I can't speak French even though I studied it from the age of 3 because I just get such performance anxiety. It's so I actually speak it better if I'm high or drunk because I'm less anxious.
Right.
But that's true for a lot of people.
So that would make an entertaining space if you were high drunk in Paris playing the piano and trying to speak French. I think that's probably your ideal gig setting.
Well, there's like an episode of The Family Guy called Wasted Talent where he can only play when he's hammered.
When he's wasted. And so Max is doing these playlists for DMT therapy, right?
Yeah, he made a playlist for the DMT trials, and it's beautiful. He's very gifted. John Hopkins as well has been making music for a variety of different psychedelic settings, and he also has an album just called Music for Psychedelic Therapy.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of musicians, including yourself, who are very passionate about making functional music that will impact your brain and your soul in a healing manner. And it's beautiful. And it gets back to what I was saying earlier. The music is more important than the drug.
Agreed. And harder to weaponize, of course, in some ways. In some ways, potentially, but still doable.
I mean, some would argue that, there's a good line from, I think it's Dennis Leary, an American stand-up comedian. He says, it's not that the government doesn't want you to do drugs. They want you to do their drugs. They want you to do SSRIs. They want you to do alcohol. They want you to do the dummy drugs that make you less politically active. And there is a grain of truth to that, marijuana is, obviously incredibly beneficial. But it also has a downside. It can make you very comfortable with being lazy and just sitting around playing video games,
Is one theory.
Depends on the person. Depends on your motivation. So, yeah.
Back down to set and setting and what music you're listening to.
And also what you're bringing to the table. What you bring in terms of your lived experiences, your traumas, your memories, your ideas, or your expectations. If you expect to have a bad trip, you may do.
Definitely. Well, this has been a good trip. It's always a trip talking to you because you go so deep on all of these subjects. So it was really amazing.
Oh, thank you. I mean, if you think this is a lot of content, you should hear what it's like inside my head, man. It's just nonstop barrage of words and stuff, and it's just
we do want to hear, and we hope to continue these discussions.
Yeah,
in the
this has been an enormous pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
It's amazing to hear, and this
has been wonderful. This has been a huge pleasure.
We've covered a lot, but there seems like there's a lot. There's always so much more.
There's so much more. You know, it's a gift to be alive, and it's easy to forget that if you're going through a hard time, if you're depressed or if you're grieving. It's really easy to forget how lucky we are to be alive, and that's one of the biggest things that both music and psychedelics can give you is help you rediscover just being grateful that you're here.
I think that's good advice for anyone who's listening to this, who's suffering from anything at all, and wants to remove that Buddhist notion of life is suffering, and to challenge their suffering and to overcome it or come through it. And what advice would you give the people who are interested in maybe experiencing psychedelic therapy as a way of improving it? Because you've been to so many of these clinics around the world and you're so aware of it. Is there any place that you'd recommend or any option, or is it just Facebook Marketplace? And
I don't want to. I mean, I do think small pharma is amazing. I mean, at the moment, it's not regulated, right? And it's not legal. Like you can do. It's funny. So actually, magic mushrooms are decriminalized in places like Denver, in California, in Oakland. There's a bunch of places in America where it's decriminalized. In Canada, it's not decriminalized, but you can get special access to psilocybin for anxiety in cancer and death.
Yeah.
So if you have a terminal illness, you can apply for a license to take psilocybin for the anxiety you have. And that's actually some of the most amazing research. So they started giving psilocybin to cancer patients like 20 years ago because there was basically, at the time, nobody was being given psychedelics in a research setting because they were thought to be so dangerous. But these were people who were going to die anyways. So the scientists were like, well, why don't we give it a go? They're going to die anyways.
What have we got to lose?
Exactly. And the people in those trials, they just had an incredible shedding of fear.
It was around 80% reported a huge change in experience and quality of life.
And basically it gave them their ability to enjoy the last days.
Yeah, because these are people with terminal.
Yeah, so rather than sitting at home and sulking and being miserable and fearing death, it allowed them to enjoy what they had. Well, it also it's actually after the psilocybin, it allowed them to enjoy the time they had left with their family and their friends and life and their garden and so forth. So in Canada, you can apply for a license, but it takes months to get the psilocybin license. And in those months, you could die. So the process is bureaucratic and slow. Yeah. In the Netherlands, you can take truffles recreationally, but you can't take them for therapy. So it's the opposite. And in the UK, there's a group who are campaigning to reschedule psilocybin for people. They want to sort of do more of a model of the Canadian system.
Right.
So there's a bunch of different approaches. So at the moment, it depends on where you live, is the short answer. So if you live in Denver, go and get some mushrooms. It's decriminalized. You can do whatever you want. Magic mushrooms are interestingly legal in Jamaica, where they do a lot of the research because it's legal there, but Jamaicans don't take them. They prefer to smoke weed.
Yes.
So ayahuasca is...
There's a strong cultural association with death.
I mean, because mushrooms grow on rotten material, right?
Yeah.
They grow on dead trees, on dead animals.
Yes,
so they are very much associated with the cycle of life and death.
Yeah.
So, what would my advice be? It depends on where you live. There are private clinics that you can go to.
So if money was no object, you could go anywhere in the world?
There is a clinic, it's very sad actually. There's a group called Synthesis, and I went there in the Netherlands in 2019 as a journalist. The cost for an average person is $2,000. I went for free as a writer. And the people who ran it, I would say, are the real deal. They are the therapists were so amazing.
Yeah.
I have never seen people melt down so hard. I have done a lot of psychedelics, and I don't like the group setting. I'm done with it. I have a lot of hypervigilance, so when I hear people barfing and screaming and crying, it just snaps me sober. I don't have a bad trip. I just feel sober.
Yes.
So I'm done with the group thing.
Harder to let go,
The peyote was different. Like peyote circles, I found to be very warm and humane and gentle, and that group is nice. And I do like doing psychedelics with friends for fun. But if I want to go into deep introspection and deal with some pain or trauma or the grief of my mom, for example, I want to do it alone.
Yeah.
But when I did the psychedelic session at Synthesis, this was 4 years ago in the Netherlands, I've never seen these people melt down so hard, and everyone was screaming all around me. And at one point, I was like, "Oh God, I'm not going to be able to trip."
That's not the soundtrack you want.
No. So at that point, I was like, you know what? Enough with this. I'm not going to be able to trip. I might as well take off my blindfold and look around me because I'm here to write about these people. So I took off my blindfold. One of the therapists, this woman named Tessa, who's awesome, she said that when she saw me take off my blindfold, she went, "Oh no, she's gonna." And I've just the carnival of madness all around me. I've never seen anything like it. And there was a lot of people there who were like in their 50s and 60s who'd never taken a psychedelic.
Right.
There was a woman there in her 60s who was just screaming and crying and wailing about her dad dying when she was 20. There was this Italian woman.
A lot of release.
Oh my God, the craziest was this Italian woman thrashing and wailing and screaming and laughing and like just so completely hysterical. I couldn't, I've never seen anything like it. Not even at a music festival. It was...
Not even at a music
No,
festival.
I've never seen anything like this woman losing her mind. They ended up carrying her out of the room and took her to bed and gave her some food. The mental thing was the next day, she was totally fine. Totally fine. And she confessed to us that for 30 years she'd had anorexia and almost died many times.
Okay.
And that in her trip, she only saw visions of food. She saw banquets of beautiful food.
Wow.
And she thought, oh my God, I've spent the majority of my life not enjoying this amazing thing. And her heart ripped in half, and then she just went crazy.
Wow.
And then the next day, though, she just had this lightness to her. And she was so clear-headed, and she spoke to us so lucidly and so honestly about it. I bawled. It was so
Wow.
beautiful. And then right after her, there was this tech bro from New York who said, so I've been in marketing with this company for 7 years, and I think I want to pivot my career, so I came here to start to get some insights. And I was like, I hate you! Die! Some people have real problems! So what would my advice be? I don't know. There's a lot of places you can go and spend a lot of money. You can go down to South America and you can spend a lot of money. To be perfectly honest, the best experiences I have had have been free. Have been, for example, with some LSD that were given to me for my birthday. I paid nothing for my best experiences, but I'm very experienced with them, and they're not for everybody. So if you want to be in a safe container where you feel held, do some research. There's a lot of, it's, as we said, there's no yellow pages.
But it wouldn't be doing ketamine, right? You wouldn't be recommending the ketamine clinics. You'd be saying maybe look at some of the places in Holland or Jamaica.
Yeah, I
and
would.
Psilocybin.
Yeah, I would actually. I mean, also Oregon is right now setting up a program of legal access, but there's been a lot of controversy there because a lot of those clinics are going bankrupt, and they've been enrolling students in teacher training programs, and now the students have paid fees, but they're not getting their education. So I'm not sure what's going on there. It's unfortunate. So I can't really advocate for any particular clinic in general. I would not advocate Field Trip. I think they're charlatans, and I don't care if they hear this and they think that I'm insulting them, because I am. I don't know who I would suggest, and it's going to be dodgy. And there are also
some cautions and contraindications there.
Yeah, there's also, there's a lot of amazing therapists in the underground. There are some total charlatans. I interviewed this total asshole posh brat. I don't know if I want to call her by name on this podcast.
No, let's keep the names out.
But she is a medical doctor who used to work in ER or in A&E, and she decided to give up her medical license practicing A&E medicine and instead give out psilocybin therapy. Fine, but she has no psychological qualifications. She's not a trained therapist. She doesn't know anything in that field. And she charges £4,500 for one psilocybin session. And she says she prefers to work with what she calls high-functioning individuals, which means rich people, bankers, and tech bros. She doesn't work, and she overtly said to me, I don't work with trauma, and I don't work with depression because I'm not qualified. So this is someone who was making a bad income in the very stressful environment of A&E, who's decided instead to make a fortune giving psilocybin to rich dudes. Now, if you have a better income and a better lifestyle doing that, just admit it. Don't give me this bullshit that you're making the world a better place in a more meaningful way by doing this instead. It's incredibly vacuous and self-absorbed.
I mean,
there's a lot of bad actors.
It's quite an amazing thing to work in A&E, and I have a lot of respect for the people who are frontline medical. Yeah.
Absolutely. I am in nothing but awe of people who work in that environment.
So that's your recommendation, is no recommendation except for avoiding these places.
I don't know. I mean, you have to sort of be in this scene for a while to be able to get a sense for people. So I met a psychedelic therapist. So Fred Fellows, who runs the Secret Garden Party, emailed me and this woman, and he said, you two have to meet. And I didn't know anything about her. I arrived at her house and instantly felt at home. There were record albums all over the walls, all these classic like Motown stuff. She was playing Stand By Me when I walked in. There was incense burning. She had a beautiful dog that was a Canadian.
At that point, dog, incense, Stand
Perfect.
By Me.
So she's 50 years.
Setting.
She was so down to earth. So she's a qualified therapist with the BACP, British Association of Psychotherapists. And she has been in the field for 30 years. She has done shamanic training, but she said she would never have the audacity to call herself a shaman. Yeah. She was the one who came up with the line, trust a fairy.
It's equivalent calling yourself a hero, isn't it? It's something that you would be titled. It's not a self-titling.
Yes, exactly. She's the one who came up with the brilliant line, trust a fairy and bongo wankers.
Okay.
And she says that she spends a lot of time cleaning up cases of people who have gone for an ayahuasca ceremony, for example, and lost their minds and need serious psychological healing afterwards because they may have seen something very traumatizing and then were given no aftercare.
Yeah.
She's very passionate about this thing, integration. How do you take care of somebody? Because you can shake up somebody really raw with a psychedelic insight, and people can be very fragile afterwards, and they need a lot of support. So she's amazing. And when I met her, she said, but people don't believe that I'm a psychedelic therapist because I'm Black, I'm 50, and I love Gucci. You know, she doesn't wear feathers in her hair, no bullshit. She's amazing. You know, there's a lot of people in the underground and the overground. It's a mixed bag. Some of them are liars. You get, as I like to say, assholes come in every color of humanity's great rainbow.
Yes. Very true.
In every field. So, you know, I can't really give advice on specific companies or specific groups. It will become more clear, I think, over the coming years. I do think small pharma are the real deal. I really did think synthesis were the real deal, and I still do. I mean, I don't speak economics very well.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know how it's all going to turn out. I just know that money often poisons the broth. And if basically, you know, a lot of the companies that I respect the most, or same thing with the musicians that I respect the most, it's not about the money. It's about the music, or it's about the therapy. If money is your primary motivation, it's always going to go wrong.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah.
So don't be doing the psychedelic work to get the lottery numbers or to increase your tech bro outcomes, right? Your marketing schedule.
Yes.
I think that's good.
There you go.
There we go.
There you go. So thank you so much for having me. This has been
Zoe.
absolutely amazing.
Appreciate it.